Hey guys, so I shared a survey to all Yu-Gi-Oh players, which I did last year as well, and it's something I want to try every year with a slightly different set of questions. Anyways, a big thanks to all of you for participating, and a bigger thanks to any of you that shared the survey, as we got an amazing turnout of 1,654 responses. Now, if you don't want to miss out on any of my future surveys, with the next one being my ban list prediction survey, make sure to follow me on Twitter at HakunaMyData. So let's start with some demographic results. Starting with gender, we have the majority, about 86% identifying as male, with another 2% identifying as female, and a few percentages identifying as trans male, trans female, or gender variant / non-conforming, or other. Now, gender response options for surveys are always a little bit tricky, so I did go with what seemed to be standard based on what I researched online. As for age, none of the respondents were below 12, with almost half of the respondents being in the 19 to 24 range, and another third being in the 25 to 29 range. But you're of course never too old to play the game as long as you have the time, with 0.7% of the respondents being over 40 years old. As for the top 5 countries with the most responses, we have the USA taking up slightly more than half of all respondents, and then we have UK, Canada, Germany, and Australia as the next 4, and it's funny because in last year's survey, this was the exact same order of countries as well. At a close 6 was Brazil in both years too. Now, as for player profile, I asked how players identified themselves in terms of competitiveness, which basically comes down to the level of tournament play you participate in. So 46% identified as casual, so basically only play with friends and maybe go to locals rarely. Then we had about a third of players saying they're semi-competitive, so going to locals regularly but never bigger level tourneys like regionals and YCSs. About 19% identified as competitive players who do go to these larger events regularly, and lastly, 1% of respondents identified as not playing the game at all, so they could be something like vendors, collectors, or artists. Now keep in mind that this likely isn't a representation of the true Yu-Gi-Oh population, because most likely there's way more casual players than there are competitive players, which you could probably say about any game. Just keep in mind that my channel's audience is mainly competitive, and while this survey did get shared a lot on Twitter and possibly a lot of casual players responded as well, I do think that more competitive players were likely to respond. In terms of the number of years played, this usually looks about the same each time I ask this question, where most of the players played this game for over 10 years. The game did come out around 2002 for the TCG, so as more time passes by, of course, everyone will start shifting into this category. Now, since the return of in-person premier events, most notably YCS Charlotte back in April, I asked how the interest in the game has changed for players. So if I group casual and non-players as casual, and the semi-competitive and competitive as competitive players, you see that the interest was most likely to stay about the same for the casual group, whereas it was much more likely to have increased for competitive players. Makes sense, since competitive players are going to in-person events, particularly larger ones, so the return of premier events means a lot more. Now, in terms of tournament participation compared to before the pandemic, while a big chunk and 41% don't participate in tourneys at all, among those that do, you do see that they were participating more often than they did before the pandemic. As for the frequency of how often they go to tournaments per week, looks like most are going about once or less than once per week. Now you see that about 43% don't participate, which isn't the exact same as the 41% in the left figure, since people don't necessarily respond consistently on surveys. In terms of the highest level achievement in Konami sanctioned tournaments, so I actually messed this question up at first because I did not have an option available for people that do participate but never topped at any level, so that was my mistake, my apologies, and thanks to Brian on Twitter for pointing that out, and I was able to add that option in right away near the beginning of when the survey went live. Anyways, we see that most people have a local top as their highest level of achievement, excluding those that don't participate in tournament play at all, of course. Now, the terminology for regional top can get a little tricky because let's say Toronto Regionals, for example, a top is technically top 8 because that's when you get prizing, but up to top 48 still get invites to Nats, so a lot of times people mistakenly say they topped when they play something like 44th, which to me personally, I don't care when people do that because that's still an achievement nonetheless, but just from a survey perspective, I suspect that not everyone responded to this question accurately. Also interesting to see that we did have a select few people who were Worlds competitors, which is really cool. Next up on the survey was a section on spending, and to play this game competitively, you see that most players did think the game was too expensive, which isn't surprising. Interesting that casual players were more likely to say the game is too expensive even though they don't actually play competitively, which for many maybe is the reason why they don't even want to bother playing competitively. And for the 0.1% that said that the game is not expensive at all, well, I guess they're just too rich for us. In terms of the level of concern that players have on the amount of money they spend on this game, this is what it looked like. Now in hindsight, I should have added a response option for not spending money on this game at all, which might be why casual players were more likely to not be concerned at all, because some of them may not actually be spending actual money on this game. For competitive players, of course, they would all certainly be spending at least some kind of money, so they were less likely to not be concerned and seem to be moderately concerned for the most part. As for how much sealed product they bought, I just went with what people bought in the last month, only because it's going to be kind of hard to remember what you bought on a long-term basis, although the downside of this is that it might just happen to be the month where you bought a lot more or a lot less than usual. So whether casual or competitive, most were likely to not buy any at all, and competitive players are also probably more likely to go for singles only instead, but almost half seems to have bought anywhere between a few packs to a few boxes, although a very small amount would buy at least a case, as that's where it gets really expensive. As for the favorite type of sealed product, there's a lot of options of course, but looks like both casual and competitive players really like reprint sets the most, and these are things like the Megatins, Battles of Legend, and even a set like Duel Devastator. The second most favorite was Structured X, with it being especially more popular among casual players. Not surprising to see that OTS packs were much more likely to be favorite among competitive players than casual players, since you can only get OTS packs by participating in official Konami tournaments, unless you buy them secondhand from other players. So Konami, hope you're watching this, and please print Dude 2.0. Next I asked about people's primary online Yu-Gi-Oh simulator of choice, and with the release of Master Duel earlier this year, that seemed to be the favorite among casual players by far, while not surprisingly, Dueling Book is still the go-to simulator for competitive players. EDO Pro is still pretty popular among both player groups, and there's a steep decline with YG Omega and Dueling Nexus. As for how long they play their simulator of choice per week, looks like a vast majority play up to 10 hours per week, and not too huge of a difference whether they were casual or competitive players. I think if I asked this question earlier in the year when Master Duel first released, the amount of playing time would probably be way higher, but now especially with in-person events returning, the amount of time they spend online is likely less than during the core pandemic period. So now let's get into the favorite type of YouTube content, and there's so many different categories I couldn't possibly capture all of them, but you see a glimpse of the most popular ones here, with series content like the Progression series, Duel Night, Master Saga being the most popular. Now I initially didn't have the series content as an option until a big YouTuber messaged me about it, so I did add it later in the survey, so thanks for pointing that out. So if I restrict the survey results to after I added that survey option, which would still be about 1100 responses, you do see that series content was even more popular. After that, looks like people really enjoyed deck profiles and replays, but can't underestimate those meme videos either. So now let's move on to the favorite Yu-Gi tuber responses, and we will cover the top 15 this time just so I can try to include as many YouTubers as I can, and starting at 15th place is GGYGO. Really have exploded to the scene recently, as he went from less than 1,000 subs to 13k in a very short time, most well known for helpful videos on where to hand trap and other good meta tips. Next we have Team Samurai X1, one of the biggest Yu-Gi-Oh channels out there with a lot of deck profiles and pack openings, but his Duel Night series is honestly the Yu-Gi-Oh content with the highest production quality out there, and it's absolutely amazing. And then we have Kali Effect at 13th, who has really good insight on what cards to buy and sell, but also brings a lot of tier list videos on meta and rogue decks as well as staples, and his videos are actually what inspired me to do my tier list by the data videos as well. Next up is Pac, who provides really good meta content, and among the active YouTubers, I think it's safe to say he's the best competitive player. Super smart player, and you will learn a lot watching his video as well as his streams. After that we have Revs Cards, most known for his Yu-Gi-Oh from Scratch series, and more recently, playing Yu-Gi-Oh properly, provides a lot of good deck building through sealed formats and lots of fun gameplay as well. And then we have Team APS, who has a whole host of different series and provides a lot of nostalgic content featuring gameplay using old structure decks, and also brings a lot of funny skits. Also one of the biggest names out there among Yu-Gi tubers. And then we have the Altergeist God and DZeef, who has always provided great insight on cards or archetypes, but is now also providing the Master Saga, where he faces off Farfight using only packs from Master Duel and provides a lot of fun gameplay. Next we have the Duologs, who is also a giant channel and is most known for bringing the top 10s kind of videos, and probably does that better than anyone. After that we have this Encoder, who is most known for providing content related to Yu-Gi-Oh rulings, because this game is for lawyers and he helps break down difficult rulings for those of us who can't read, which is, well, all of us. At 6 we have Crush Cards, featuring Logan, Brian, and all of their alpacas. They provide a whole variety of content from deck profiles, openings, vlogs, and also lore, which is pretty unique. A channel that brings a lot of positive energy with all of their videos as well. Okay, so now let's cover the top 5 favorite Yu-Gi tubers in a slightly more dramatic fashion. Coming in at number 5, it's Simo. Also one of the biggest names out there, and is the creator of the Progression series, which has of course spawned into so many other series on his channel or other people's channels. Brings a lot of enthusiasm into all of his videos, and it's interesting to see what other new series Simo will bring next. At number 4 is Rank 10 YGO, or Rada. Doesn't provide videos too often, but is always listed as one of the favorites when this question is asked anywhere, and brings a lot of humor into his content, and also is known for his archetype archive videos. Also, for those of you that still don't know by now, Rada is actually the one that started the infamous It's Morbin Time meme, which got so famous to a point where Sony brought back Morbius to theaters because they thought people actually wanted to see it. So really cool to see that Yu-Gi-Oh player started such a cultural trend. At number 3 is the DB Grinder. Really has been growing fast over the last couple of years, where he brings excellent commentary over high-rated competitive Dueling Book matches. Also a very good player himself, as he was a former Worlds competitor, so if you want to play competitively and want to get better, make sure to leave some time to watch his videos. At number 2 is Farfa, another big channel in the game, and he provides a whole lot of humor in all of his videos, and his Table 500 featuring replays of really janky combos is super fun to watch. Also the biggest streamer out there for the Yu-Gi-Oh! TCG, and I personally have to thank him for helping me grow my channel with various shoutouts. I really wouldn't be here without him. And finally, the number 1 most voted favorite Yu-Gi tuber with essentially a quarter of all votes is Joseph Rothschild, aka MBT. Well known for his progression playoffs, but also of course his 10-minute testing of a variety of decks, and I was always so impressed with how fast he could commentate over those EDO Pro replays. Brings a lot of humor into his videos, and it's fun to watch him talk about the game, so well deserved. A big congrats to you, but also every Yu-Gi tuber out there. Alright, so now to finish off, let's cover what I call the fun questions. First is who your favorite protagonist was from the various Yu-Gi-Oh! Anime, and I get it, not everyone watched the anime, but I'm sure you at least heard some of these characters if you play the game, so you just had to pick whoever you were most familiar with. So it turns out the most favorite was actually Yusei from 5Ds. I only watched the first season of 5Ds myself, but it was really good, and he was a pretty cool character with a good backstory. Following Yusei is Jaden from GX, and I never really watched GX, but I think people usually liked his character development as well. And then we have the main protagonist in Yugi, who everyone will be most familiar with. Then there's this steep drop off with the rest of the protagonists from the more recent shows, and I personally never watched those shows, so I didn't even know who the protagonists were and I had to look them up. Then we had a vote on which of Yugi, Kaiba, or Joey's monsters was their favorite. Now I again had a few people messaging me saying how they absolutely hate all of these monsters and refuse to respond, so I'll have an option next time for not liking any of them, but in the end, it's just a fun question. You just had to go with whatever you hated the least in that case. So the most favorite was Blue Eyes, very iconic monster, and still to this day is the strongest normal monster at 3000 attack. Follow that is Red Eyes with Dark Magician last, but still pretty close. From a meta standpoint, they all had their fair share of success, with Blue Eyes winning Worlds at some point, and Red Eyes and Dark Magician seeing a lot of play recently when Anaconda was still legal, so that they can be used to bring out Dragoon. And finally, in terms of the favorite special summoning mechanic, we have Synchro at number 1, followed by Xyz at a close second. Synchro and Xyz mechanics were really cool because monster levels became much more important to consider in deck building. Fusion was next and is really the oldest special summoning mechanic out there, along with Ritual, which came last. Players that respond to Link as their favorite are probably more likely to be competitive players, and sadly we don't see much love for the Pendulum mechanic, which pretty much represents about the same love that Konami gives to it as well. Alright guys, so that was it for the survey responses. Again, thank you so much for participating and or sharing the survey. I'll do this again next year with a slightly different set of questions, and I'll also open it up next time before doing the survey to get your input on what questions you want to be asked. As always, a huge thanks to my Patreons, Eileen Dice Queen, Bolt Spider, Cybernetic, Brandon Jaren, Barrelord, Spooky Boogie, and Gridora. Thank you for your continued support. The data file for these survey responses and the analysis is now available for you guys. And if you're interested in joining the Patreon as well, the link is down below. And if you want more data content, consider subscribing to the channel as well. Take care, guys.